Welcome, dear learners. Today we'll be discussing the modern age. Modern period. When Thomas Hardy died in 1928, the world appeared to be recovering from the consequences of the First World War. Though the recovery had been slow and painful, the long-sighted people were still uneasy about the outlook. The case for literature with a purpose is obvious, and literature is more than pamphleteering, and it is not the mere statement of a problem. And that's how politics was called as the art of the possible, and poetry was called as the art of the desirable. The few key terms of modern poetry, tradition and experiment in modern poetry includes abundance of output. One of the leading characteristics of the poetry of the new era is the abundance of its output. The variety, quantity of modern publications was abundant in nature, and at the same time, modern poetry became a poetry of revolt against tradition. It became more experimental in nature. And this new poetry, the modern poetry, is a poetry of revolt. Both you could see in form as well as the content of the poetry. Especially the revolt is exemplified in the poetry of T.S. Eliot, and realism in subject matter has led the modern poet to reject the highly ornate or artificial poetic style of the Romantics, where the language resembled closely the language of everyday life. And the poets found delight in the sensuous beauty of nature. For the modern poet, nature is almost like a box of toys. A deep feeling of love and joy in nature became a prominent characteristics of some of the poets like W.H. Davies or Edmund Blunden. But here, the modern poets, they do not spiritualize nature like Wordsworth or Shelley, but they were content to render nature through the senses, and thus Eliot does not even write nature of the countryside. He was strictly urban in nature. The next key term is humanitarian spirit, where the poets are moved by the suffering and the forceful plea for a humane treatment of this and nature especially. It is a deepened sense of pity for the poor or for the suffering of human beings, or it may be nature. So they concentrated on criminals, suicides, prostitutes, drunkards. They were given a sympathetic treatment in modern poetry. The next key term is disillusionment. The new poetry is very realistic, and the poet's consciousness of the grim realities of life has shattered all illusions and romantic dreams. The tragedy of everyday life was portrayed, and the poetry could be called as bitter and pessimistic. But it was poignant and heartrending, and the poems were it was the outcome of the contemplation of the stark realities of life. And few of the poems, they carried the religious note and metaphysical note, especially 17th century Donne's ideas and intellectual qualities were reflected. And one of the important key terms of modern poetry is symbolism. They have the romantic longing for a more perfect world, and these symbolists you could find in John Masefield or Edward Thomas, they had the greatest love of the 20th century, and the French symbolist influenced these writers. Under the influence of French symbolist poets like W.B. and Eliot, they made extensive use of symbolism to communicate their vision and sensations. Next, we concentrate on Edwardian poets, who are also called as the transitional poets, where Rudyard Kipling comes first. He's called as an imperialist who celebrated the British Empire, and especially with his work White Man's Burden. Kipling was essentially the poet of soldiers and sailors, and many of his poems are written on the exploits of British soldiers in foreign lands. And Kipling shows a great skill as craftsman and metrist, but he lacks that intensity of vision which results in great poetry. Next, Thomas Hardy is called as a pessimistic poet. The two great pessimists of the Edwardian age are Thomas Hardy and A.E. Housman. Their poetry is the final expression of the disillusionment resulting from the advance of science, you could say, and the disintegration of faith and traditional values. The pessimism is a characteristic feature of Hardy's fiction and also his poetry, where he reveals the consciousness of miseries and sufferings of human life, as well as, though you could find mutual sympathy, there would also be a portrayal of social reform in his works. Houseman is also a pessimist, where he had love of nature and his nature poetry is refreshing. At the same time, he carried the gloom of philosophy in his works. Robert Bridges, he was known for the subjects like beauty, love, and nature. The beauties of nature, the charm of landscape in his poetry are impressive. And he learned the art of poetry very painstakingly. He's a great artist with words, but others say Bridges lacked the force and intensity of Shelley's lyrics. And he is a poet of joy and optimism. And he is a great lover of the beauty of nature. His enjoyment of nature is personal, as well as in the same time, it is so simple and direct, unaffected by any artificiality. Next comes G.M. Hopkins, who's a religious poet of the 20th century. And Wreck of Deutschland is 1872's longest and most difficult poem. It recounts the death of 5 nuns who went down in the ship of that name. It is a poem marked with tragic pathos. The last 5 years of his life were spent in distress, and he felt that God had forsaken him. So this feeling urged him to write sonnets of personal character. Maybe he tried to express his inner gloom and frustration. Next, we move to Georgian poets. We have few poets under this category. The first comes John Masefield, who succeeded Robert Bridges as poet laureate in 1930. And his poems contain many true Chaucerian sketches of human figures, and his poetry is charged with democratic sympathy for the downtrodden. And he's a great sea poet, and few poets have been able to capture the atmosphere, maybe the life of the sea or the ships, the sailor, in a vivid manner. Next is W.H. Davis, who was known for a particular work, the autobiography of Supertramp, and he's a lyric poet. His lyrics are short as well as spontaneous. Out of 400 poems in his collected poems, 270 or only of 3 stanzas or even less. There is a note of tender sympathy in Davies' poems, and for animals and children especially. And next comes W.B. Yeats, who is known for his symbolism. And this modern writer, or when you take the modern age, Yeats has the highest position as a writer, and he is considered much superior to Browning, Tennyson, and Arnold. And he has a bulk of poems and variety in his poetry, and his creative range is immense. He writes with perfect ease and mastery on themes taken from high standard of performance, every possible life incident. And his poetry, or his artistic nature, is the keynote of Yeats' poetry. And he tries to portray a kind of a dreamy atmosphere, and it is a world of a Celtic twilight, and the imagery is vague. Sometimes he has used Irish mythology, folklore, and thus W.B. Yeats is a significant poet of the Georgian period. So Yeats is a symbolist from the beginning to the end of the career. That is one point which we need to remember. And the symbols are highly suggestive, and his poetry has exceptional complexity, richness, and intensity. Next comes Ezra Pound. He is known as an imagist, and these images, they try to represent real life in images that were clear, precise, and exact. Poetry should restrict itself to the world perceived by the senses and to the presentation of its themes in a succession of concise, clearly visualized, concrete images, says Ezra Pound. He's the original poet of this school, where the thoughts and the emotions of human beings with images, through images, it evolved new rhythms in his poetry. And next comes war poets. We have Rupert Brooke, who's called as a soldier poet, and we have Edith Sitwell and Wilfred Owen. Rupert Brooke, he has written a number of war sonnets expressing his patriotic enthusiasm and noble resolve to serve the country. The marks of greatness in his poems are few, but he has a particular place under war poetry, says A.C. Ward, the critic. Edith Sitwell expresses the futility and tragedy of life, where he talks about the gloom and frustration generated by the war. And few of his poems, like Song of the Cloud and the Canticle of the Sun, it brings out the impact of the Second War on the poets. And we also have Wilfred Owen, where the poem Strange Meeting is a perfect example of how, just because of the borders, two countries, they are involved in a war. And next we concentrate on Auden group, W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, C.D. Lewis, and Dylan Thomas. W.H. Auden has become a part of the American literary scene as T.S. Eliot has been of the English. And he studied the life of common man and the social problems confronting him in the post-war world. And he was, his early poetry it talks about the faith in a violent social revolution. Stephen Spender is interested in the uplift or the empowerment of the masses, and he has constantly advocated social reform on communistic lines. And he's an artist of fine sensibilities, and his work is widely admired for his lyrics especially. C.D. Lewis gives the clearest expression to the revolutionary doctrines, and even in the work Magnetic Mountain, he makes an attack on the existing social order, and thus he makes an appeal for revolution. Dylan Thomas is closely associated to the revival of religious poetry in the 1940s, and he's also recognized as the father of new romantic poetry of the post-war period. But Dylan Thomas is a difficult poet, for his poetry is packed with metaphor and symbolic imagery. Next, we move to modern novel and drama, where we have English novel before the war, and novel was given an art form by Henry James, an American, and he developed the theory of the novel in his famous critical work, The Art of Fiction. And apart from that, we also have the realists, George Moore, who was a realist who tried to paint life realistically in his works. And we have George Gissing, who was interested in the study of the poor people and their mean and poor existence. Grub Street is his popular work. And then comes Samuel Butler, one of the original thinkers of this modern age, where he has written The Way of All Flesh, and he exercised considerable influence on the younger novelists. And next comes Rudyard Kipling, who is a prolific and versatile writer. And a few critics say he's a romancer of the present, of the modern social order, and he is an imperialist, and his tales are so many glorifications of the British Empire and the British rule. Arnold Bennett was essentially a realist and a regionalist who's known for The Old Wives' Tale, and Bennett had become an interpreter of the life and society of a particular region. And H.G. Wells, a scientific fiction writer, he had his own ideas about the nature and the function of fiction, and he considered it as a powerful instrument of moral and social suggestion as well as propaganda. His novels like Time Machine, The Invisible Man, it dealt with scientific subjects in an imaginative way. And Joseph Conrad is very important in the history of English novel, and he wrote in English with distinction, and he was a contemporary of the traditional novelists like Arnold Bennett, H.G. Wells, and Galsworthy, but his work is entirely different from others. He's a great technical innovator, we could say. And Next comes James Joyce. James Joyce is known for the stream of consciousness technique, and his work Ulysses is much appreciated. At the same time, there are a lot of critics where they say it was very difficult to understand. And James Joyce in Ireland was he influenced Virginia Woolf, who was a novelist who imparted form and discipline, and thus made stream of consciousness a popularly accepted form. Virginia Woolf is known for her To the Lighthouse, and the same technique, the stream of consciousness, is a revolutionary technique where it is based on the revolutionary concept of reality. And the modern novel, Virginia Woolf, she enunciates the modern psychological novelist, and she denounces the novelist as materialists, or they try to concentrate more on the psychological complexities of the individuals. Next, we move to the angry young men category, where we have in the drama, English drama, in the modern age may be broadly divided into two categories. One is the prose drama, which dealt with contemporary social problems, focusing attention on the problems and discussing them in various angles. The second significant development is the revival of poetic drama. And despite the efforts of Victorian poets, there were many who brought significant changes in the drama. And we could find realism, drama of ideas, the Irish movement, and even the stage manners. It had a lot of significant changes in the modern age. And coming to angry young men, this term is loosely applied to both the dramatist and the novelist of the 1950s, where the mood of the angries was portrayed, especially in John Osborne's Look Back in Anger. And from there, it started, where these kind of novels focused on a post-war generation portraying anger, petulance, dissatisfaction, infirmity of purpose, railing and complaining. Next comes the theatre of the absurd, is a term used by Martin Esslin to describe the new theatre of 1950s. It was based on the philosophy of existentialism of Camus and Sartre, according to which the universe and an individual's life in it are too chaotic and too irrational to be reduced to a comprehensible system. And thus, theatre of the absurd was a phrase derived from Camus' philosophy, and we have certain writers who were popularized the theatre of absurd drama. Samuel Beckett is one of them. Even Harold Pinter belongs to this. And next we talk about Harold Pinter, where he shows the influence of Beckett and the theatre of the absurd, particularly in the works like The Room, The Birthday Party, The Caretaker. He is good at creating suggestions of an unnameable and unpredictable calamity. George Bernard Shaw had the longest career in English dramatic history, for his first play, Widowers' Houses, was staged in 1892, and his most recent work, Good King Charles' Golden Days, appeared in 1939. And he talks about the emancipation of new women, female depravity, social and economic aspects of prostitution, and thus he talks about the social problems. And his plots and characters were full of drama and suspense. The dialogue is witty and realistic in nature. John Galsworthy, he occupies a distinctive place in modern English drama, where his dramas are like a tree which springs from the seeding of a thought or idea. John Galsworthy came to the theatre with a silver box, and for a quarter of a century produced a number of dramas on current social problems, especially strife, which deals with the struggle between capital and labor. So thus in this presentation, we have discussed modern age and the modern poets, novelists, and the dramatists. Thank you.